Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to a Mavuika combos video. I've seen a few videos on Mavuika already, but there's a bunch of stuff that I want to add. There's a bunch of nuance to her combos, a lot of different ways you can end up playing her, and a lot of different characters that interact differently with her kit. And so what I want to do is I want to go through a lot of those different characters and how and why they work or they don't work with Mavuika, as well as some tips to increase your damage for the teams where you use those characters by doing the optimal combos for each. For most of this video, I'll be using low-level bonus greatsword, dual blade on Bennett without the 4-piece obsidian on Mavuika, just because it'll be a lot easier to properly show rotations if the enemies aren't dying to the burst initial hit. So, first thing that we need to get out of the way before we get into all of the combo stuff is how we're going to refer to combos, or the combo notation. When you're in your bike form, you effectively have 4 different things you can do. You can do normal attacks, you can do charge attacks, you can do dashes, and you can do the final hit of the charge attack. There are technically other things you can do, like a plunge attack, but they're worthless and you shouldn't pay attention to them. Technically, you can also jump. That's true. So that's 5 things. You're gonna see 5 different letters in the combo notation. N for normal attacks, C for charge attacks, F for the final hit of the charge attack, and then you also have D and J for dash and jump. As a general rule, if you see a letter followed by a number, it means that you do the combo of that letter that many times. So for example, if you do N2, that would be 1, 2. And if the number is before the letter instead of after, it means that you do that thing that amount of time. So 2N2 would be N2, N2. And if there's any ambiguity, because there's letters followed by numbers, followed by letters, followed by numbers, there's going to be spaces so that you know if the number is associated with the first letter or the next one. So, let's start by just looking at what happens if you're just doing the default Mavuika combos. The default Mavuika combo is going to be 2N5 and 1 for the normal attack combo. Alright, you just... You just spawn normal attacks, and your burst expires right after you do your 3rd instance of the first normal attack. So that's the default normal attack combo. The default charge attack combo so you get 8 hits while the burst is still active, and then you get a final hit at the end after the burst expires. So that would be referred to as C3F. That's a default charge attack combo. Against large enemies, or if you manage to stick close enough to them, you can potentially get an additional hit from the burst. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 into F, right? So that would be C9F. Those are the default combos without any sort of cancels. And looking at those default combos, charge attack combo is like significantly better than the normal attack combo. And so outside of a very, very few exceptions, you generally just ignore the normal attacks altogether. So how exactly do these combos translate to reactions? Let's take a look with Rain on the team. You vape on the first one, the 4th one, the 5th one, and the 8th one. And then you also get a vape on the final hit. If you end up getting the, like, quote-unquote, lucky additional 9th hit. That 9th hit will vape as well, but in exchange for that, the final hit at the end will not vape. Out of all of the reasonable Mavuika combos, in my experience, I haven't found a single combo that vapes more than 5 of her attacks. There's probably some weird normal attack weaving combos that can vape like 6, but you're going to be vaping less damage because the normal attacks are so much worse than the charge attacks. With all that being said, this is just what you can get out of the default combos with no cancels. However, cancels make Mavuika much, much better. First, let's take a look at Vape teams. Her Vape teams are not her strongest teams. Citlali generally does tend to be her best teammate. But the cancels and Vape teams are a lot more straightforward, so I figured we'll start with them. If you're not interested in the Vape teams, you can use the timestamps to jump to the melt setups. When it comes to Vape teams, you have ways of increasing your damage. Right, so first of all, like I already said, unless you manage to stay really, really close to an enemy with a relatively large hitbox, you'll only get 8 charge attack hits instead of 9, right? And then you'll get your final hit. But the thing is, that final hit barely does any damage because the burst isn't active anymore. You can see whether or not the burst is active by the color of her Night Soul bar, right? So if you pay attention to the color, right now it's like white-ish. And as you can see, it expires right now, right? In the middle of the animation for the 9th hit. If you had a way of getting a different attack other than the final hit in that time window, because the final hit is much slower than the other attacks, you could potentially get a 9 hit without relying on enemy hitbox before your burst expires. And that's where cancels start coming into play. When Mavuika is in her motorcycle form and she dashes, it takes a bunch of Night Soul. However, during her burst, Night Soul generation is paused, which means you can dash as much as you want and it's not gonna cost you any Night Soul and it's not gonna mess with your duration. Because dashes are the fastest ways of doing cancels, that is very relevant. So, if we just add a dash right after a hit at any point, we end up with a 9th hit of the motorcycle before the burst expires, and because we dash, our spin duration is reset, so we don't get the final hit, right? So effectively, what ends up happening is you get one more hit of the burst buffed cyclic damage instead of the final hit. And as it turns out, the burst buff is really, really big, so that leads to a lot more damage. And what that means is that in Vape teams, your best default combo is going to be one where you dash at least once. You end up getting a total of 9 burst buffed hits, 5 of which are vapes. That's the first, I guess, layer of cancels in her vape teams. However, as you may be aware if you've looked at her kit or have played her, Mavuika's dash during her skill actually deals damage. What that means is that if you can fit in more dashes without losing charge attacks, it's effectively just free damage. However, and this is very important, her dash and her charge attack share internal cooldown. What that means is if you dash at the wrong moment, your dash will vape and it's gonna yoink one of your vapes from your charge attack. You don't want that at all. The best combo that weaves in as many dashes as possible without yoinking vapes on charge attacks is C2 dash spam. Yeah. And just like that, I ended up getting 9 charge attack hits, 5 of which were vaped, and 4 dash hits before the burst duration expired. And that is your best combo for vape teams. And as it turns out, when Mavuika inputs her charge attack while in her bike form, it procs the on-normal attack effect of Yelan and Xingqiu. And since you have to re-input a new charge attack every time you dash cancel, that effectively means that Yelan and Xingqiu function as off-field hydro applicators for Mavuika. And we, again, 9 charge attack hits, 5 of which were vaped, 4 dashes, and Yelan made it work. With Xingqiu, the orbitals are kind of enough by themselves, but we'll get into all the specific characters you can use a little bit later. But as a general rule, when it comes to application, if Yelan is enough hydro, Xingqiu is always going to be enough hydro. Anyways, what that means is that when it comes to Vape teams, your best combo in pretty much all the Vape teams is gonna be C2D spam. And the notation for the full rotation would be, or for the full combo would be, is after your burst, 4 C2D and then C. And you don't really want to keep spinning after your last charge attack hit. And so, if you look at a full rotation, three, 4, 5, and then immediately swap out and get ready for your next rotation. And then you keep going. 2, 3, 4, 5. And you keep going like this. That's how you do your combos. There are a few little nuances to the rotations outside of the Mavuika combo itself, but we'll keep that for later. So the next thing I want to talk about is going to be the melt setups. And when it comes to melt setups, things get a little bit more tricky. The reason for that is because when you apply Pyro onto a Hydro Aura, assuming both are the same amount, you will only reduce the Hydro Aura, you won't completely remove it. You'll need 2 applications of Pyro for each 1 application of Hydro. In other words, it's generally easy to apply enough Hydro to vape all of your reactable hits on your Pyro carries. However, when you're triggering Melt, it's the other way around. It's if you have a Pyro Aura on enemy, the Cryo won't necessarily remove it. You need 2 apps of Cryo to remove 1 app of Pyro. On the other hand, 1 app of Pyro will always be enough to remove whatever Cryo you have on enemies, unless it's like a big-ass elemental shield. What that means is that you need to make sure you're applying Cryo in between every single one of your Pyro applications. And that's where things can get tricky, because the Cryo applicators that we have are honestly generally not that fast at applying Cryo. And so, you will often need to intentionally reduce the amount of hits you're doing to try to make your reactions line up better. Let me show an example of that. So if you do the very default rotation with Citlali, you immediately lose your aura, right? If you have low ping and you try to use Citlali, you just use your abilities as fast as you can, you won't melt a single charge attack hit. So how do you deal with that? Well, the first step is understanding why we're not getting any melts when we do this setup. The reason is that the first off-field Cryo application that happens after Mavuika's burst animation from Citlali is actually a little bit slower to hit the enemy than the first hit of Mavuika's charge attack. So all you have to do is delay it by a tiny little bit. If you have ping higher than like 80 or something, I'm not sure exactly how much, this like wait period is effectively going to happen without you even trying to do it. With low ping, all you have to do is you just wait a tiny bit and then you are full. But we still have a problem. We still end up losing our melts halfway through. So how do you fix that? You have a few options. The first one is to just also wait a little bit after you use Mavuika's burst. Let's try to shell it. There we go. This is like the extent of what you need to know in order to be able to properly play these teams. Anything past this is ways to make doing this easier and more comfortable, not things that are actually necessary to know. But they are still important in my eyes. So, first, what's the biggest issue with something like this? Well, you don't have any good visual indicators on screen of when to start your charge attack. You kind of have to go at it by vibes, and it's really easy to mess up. So, what's the first way of making this easier to do? The first one is to just add a jump. You add a jump to your, like, while waiting. If you add a jump right after Mavuika's burst, it can line the things up for you. However, there's still also a little bit of waiting involved here, and if you just jump and then immediately go into the charge attack, it'll still be a little bit too fast. And so, personally, I tend to prefer the jump setup when you jump after the 4th hit instead of at the start. If you jump after the 4th hit, you can just wait until the enemy gets cryo again. And it tends to be a lot easier to do in practice. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is what I thought to be the best combo for melt teams in pre-release. However, it does go further than that. One thing you may have noticed is the jump here is effectively just a waste of time. You jump because you don't have anything else to do, and you're waiting for your application to line up. In other words, if you had an attack that was slower but stronger, you'd rather use that. And we talked about an attack that is slower but stronger earlier, and that's the final hit of the charge attack. Let's show the actual best combo. As it turns out, you can end up doing effectively half a charge attack. Instead of doing 8 hits into final hit, you do 3 hits into final hit, and you input that by holding for 3 hits and then releasing after the 3rd hit, and then doing the same thing again. This is the auto melt combo because you end up getting the same amount of charge attack hits that are burst buffed, except 2 of them, which on top of that are 2 of the ones that are getting reacted, are final hits instead of cyclic hits, which are around 70% more motion value each. Now, is it necessary to do any of this? Honestly, no. The default combos for Vape giving you 8 hits of charge attack versus what you get if you do the 4C2D C combo. The difference is there, and it's gonna be noticeable, but very often enemies don't die in a full rotation. They die in like either 2/3 of a rotation or 1 rotation and a half or whatever. And when that happens, it's very possible that your 10-20% higher DPS doesn't actually translate to a significantly faster clear. But a lot of people still want to know what the optimal way to play characters are, so I still think a video like this is worth making. Anyways, getting back to the final hit combo that we showed, which would be noted C3FD C3F. Although you don't necessarily need to do the dash. The dash is just additional free damage that there's no reason not to do. You do have to be careful about one thing in this combo, or I guess 2 things in this combo, right? There's 2 potential ways that this can go wrong. One, you can end up doing your cancels too slow or waiting a bit too much at the start. And if you do, your last final hit will not be burst buffed. However, if that happens, it's not that big of a deal because it's still about as much damage as if you were doing the default 8-hit 4 melts combos with the jump cancel. It's still about as much damage as that, even if you do your things a bit slow and you end up losing out on your burst buff on the final hit. It's not the end of the world. The second way you can f it up, though, matters a lot more. And that's if you do your combo too well. And this is where internal cooldown visualization is going to help a lot. The way that standard internal cooldown works is there's a hit rule and there's a time rule. Both of those rules dictate when your attacks will be able to apply an element. After your first hit has applied an element, the second and third hit will not, and then the fourth one will, right? That's the 3-hit rule, or standard ICD. But it's not the only rule. There's also the time rule. After 2.5 seconds, everything gets reset. It goes back to as if you were attacking the enemy for the first time, so your next attack will apply the element. But when I say everything gets reset, that also includes the hit rule, which means if you manage to get 4 hits against an enemy in less than 2.5 seconds, let's say 2.4 seconds, you'll get a reaction on the first hit, and then nothing on the second, nothing on the third, a reaction on the 4th hit, and then the time rule reset happens, and then the 5th hit gets a reaction again, and then 6th doesn't, 7th doesn't, 8th does. That's why the default reaction mapping for Mavuika's charge attack is reactions on hits 1, 4, 5, and 8. It's because the time rule reset happens after the 4th hit. When you do the final hit combo, you do not want the time roll reset to happen after your first final hit. Because if it does, it means that your dash can apply Pyro, and your first charge attack can apply Pyro on the second C3. The problem is, the cryo from Citlali happens around the timing of the first charge attack of the second combo, sometimes even a little bit after. In other words, in a perfect world, you'd want to react the second attack of that combo. And as it turns out, that is what will happen if you get the time roll reset before the first final hit. Because you get the time roll reset, then final hit is the first hit, then dash is the second hit, then the first hit of charge attack is the third hit, and then the second hit of charge attack is the fourth hit. So the second hit of the second charge attack is what's going to apply the element, right? That's what I got when I was showcasing it earlier. Let's show it again. Alright, we get the melt on the second hit of the charge attack. So what happens if you get the final hit before the time roll reset? And that is actually possible. If you stop holding your charge attack as early as you can after the third hit, the final hit will end up happening a tiny little bit before the 2.5 second time roll reset. And let me show you what happens when you do that. We lose our melt. As much as this is the way to f things up that punishes you the most, it's also really easy to avoid. Just don't be too sweaty when doing the final hit of the charge attack, and wait until you've actually properly seen the third hit's damage instance. If you have any amount of ping, damage hit numbers get delayed a little bit, and so it'll be even easier for you to do. But yeah, these are the default melt setups. Now, that doesn't mean that they are the only melt setups that you should think of. The main reason for that is because not every cryo unit works like Citlali. There are cryo units that can only enable you to melt at the start. With those cryo units, what you'd want to do is you'd want to do something a lot closer to what you do in Vape teams, because you get more motion value in total, and you're not going to react the later half of your charge attacks no matter what. When you're looking at something like Kaeya as a support for Mavuika, for example, you're better off doing the default Vape combos and the belt combos. And the alternative to that is what's going to happen when you have enough cryo to do some other specific combos, or to melt upwards of 5 hits instead of 4. And that is what happens with Kaeya. Now, a few caveats to this. These combos are only doable on really low ping, because Kaeya's burst duration is just barely enough to apply cryo after Mavuika's 4th melt in these setups. In other words, if you have a little bit of ping and your charge attack gets delayed by a little bit, Kaeya's last cryo application will happen before the 4th hit, so you won't have cryo application for the 5th hit. Second caveat to this, Kaeya's application kind of has RNG involved. And that leads to very inconsistent results when it comes to the application at the very, very start. Now, the application at the very, very start is a pretty big deal, because if you want to be able to get your 4th hit before the last prior application of Kaeya, not your 4th hit, but your 4th melt before the last application of Kaeya, you cannot afford to wait around a tiny little bit on Mavuika after her burst. You have to go as soon as possible. But if going as soon as possible means you apply Pyro before Kaeya's cryo, you just don't melt at all. C6 Kaeya makes that significantly more consistent because of his higher amount of hits in total. I have tested with C0 Kaeya, and I have been able to do 5 melt combos. However, I have not been able to do them very consistently. So I don't think this is something that is all that relevant if you don't have C6 Kaeya. In any case, let me show what the combo looks like. This is the combo. Unlike the Vape combos, it's not just a matter of getting your 9th hit before the burst duration is over. It's also a matter of getting your 7th hit, which is going to be your 4th melt, before Kaeya's burst is over, which is a time window that is actually shorter. You have less wiggle room. And what that means is that the slightly slower hits when you add dashes kind of f you over. And because of that, instead of doing C2D spam, I found it to be a lot more consistent to instead do C2D, C3D, C4. That has been by far the most consistent setup I've been able to do, and I have not been able to consistently replicate it with C2D spam. It might just be a skill issue, honestly, but this is definitely the setup I'd recommend. And honestly, that's pretty much it for the optimal Mavuika combos. There are a few combos that you may need to do slightly differently based on the team you're using, but these are the main ones. However, combos aren't the only thing that matters for Mavuika. If anything, combos tend to matter a bit less than proper rotations. And so I wanted to maybe not go into too much detail about the rotations, but at least just enough so that you guys can properly play the teams you want. So, the most important thing for pretty much all of the Mavuika teams is making sure that you're reacting on your burst initial hit, and that you're starting your charge attack while there's still aura on the enemy, so you don't start with a pyro aura. And depending on the characters you're using on your team, that can potentially be easier or harder. So for example, because we already have Kaeya out, let's take a look at what can go wrong in your setup with Kaeya. So, here, I'm gonna do a slightly slower setup here. Oh no! I didn't melt my burst and I'm starting without cryo. This is very bad. We don't want this to happen. No, no, no. Bad things. No, don't like. No, no, no. The reason for that is because of Mavuika's E. Now, you can decide to like hold your E and then try to spend all your like stamina, all your nice points like that. But I would pretty much almost never recommend doing that when there are setups that allow you to just use your off-field E and still start with proper auras. The reason why the slow setup didn't work for Kaeya is because Mavuika's E hit between Kaeya's E and his burst. All you need to do is make sure that you E on Kaeya right after the E hit from Mavuika. That happens by default if you're using Bennett Burst E, Shalon, and E, Kaeya, E-Q. But if you have like really high ping or something, and your stuff is slower, all you have to do is just wait until the third hit like this. I f***ed it up. That was a skill issue. Right? You just wait until the hit and you do it now, right? And you won't have too much of a problem. With Citlali. Citlali's burst initial hit is 2U cryo, so it'll wipe your pyro aura, and then the spirit skulls or thingies that get dropped by her burst have separate ICD, so they'll apply cryo, and generally that'll happen, those two apps will happen right one after the other. So as long as your Mavuika E isn't hitting right after Citlali's burst, you will pretty much be fine without having to think much about it. But if you wait too long, you'll end up losing your reactions. So don't wait too long. Also with Citlali, if you have really high ping, you can add an N1 after your Q to try to make it more consistent. With Farina, it's generally not going to be too much of a problem, but her app isn't consistent, so when it is a problem, it's kind of hard to explain why. You just got unlucky, I guess. With Yelan, you'll generally be able to do it without much of a problem. As long as you weave a normal attack before your Mavuika burst. Let's get into the characters where it's a little bit harder to get your application reliably. First is Rosaria. If you do a Rosaria setup the same way you do a Citlali setup, there we go, yeah. But if you try to do it normally, like with the same setup-ish that you do with Citlali, it's really easy for things to go wrong. Because the default setup for Citlali teams tends to be Mavuika into Shalon, into Bennett, into Citlali. If you do this, you start with a Pyro Aura. Does that mean there are no ways of dealing with it? No. The main reason why that can end up happening is that with your default setup, the window to get your Mavuika E to hit before your cryo up from Rosaria, so you actually have time to properly apply cryo before it re-hits in the middle of her animations, is pretty tight. And so one of the things you can do is you can skip Bennett's E animation to gain that time back effectively. That's like the first thing you can do. I got the initial hit there, but yeah, I didn't get the rest. I would have had to wait a little bit if I wanted to get the rest. And that brings us to the second thing you can do. You can burst E instead of E burst on Rosaria. If you E into burst, you get 2 apps from the E, 2 apps from the burst, and then 2 seconds later, another app from the burst. If you burst E instead, you get 2 apps from the burst, 2 apps from the E, and then 2 seconds after the burst, not after the E, you get your next app. So it effectively happens faster. He keeps just walking out of Rosaria Burst, so we can't do a full melt combo. But that's just because it's walking out of Rosaria Burst, which is the biggest issue with Rosaria, but won't always be a problem. Let's go against an enemy that doesn't walk out of her burst. Now, skipping the Bennett E is something that may be necessary for your setup if you're playing on high ping, but you can avoid having to do if you're playing on low ping, so the ER requirements on high ping tend to be a bit more rough. But in any case, against an enemy that doesn't move, we can get our full combo properly. One more thing to keep in mind, and that's something that applies to the Kaeya setups as well. The setups tend to be easier if you do Bennett into Shelonen than Shelonen into Bennett, because Bennett's E and Q both apply 2 units of pyro, which requires up to 4 instances of cryo to remove. Generally, it's going to be 3 because some of it decays over time. By the time your 4th one happens, generally that remaining leftover has decayed anyways. So generally, it's 3 applications of cryo that you need, but Shelonen's Crystallize can substitute an application of cryo. So the setups would tend to be a little bit easier if you Bennett into Shelonen. The next setups I want to talk about is the double cryo setups with Citlali. I think we'll be using mostly Diona because she's pretty much the slowest cryo applicator. And with Citlali, you can actually end up doing the 5 melt combos when you're playing double cryo with pretty much every cryo unit. Just like that, doing the same combo as the default Kaeya setup, we can get 5 melts on this team. And this also works on most of the other cryo teams. Most important thing to remember for these setups is swap to your non-Citlali cryo unit before you swap to Bennett. Snapshotting them is cool and all, but your Bennett burst is going to expire before a lot earlier if you use Bennett before like Rosaria, which has relatively long animations. And it's going to lead to you just losing Bennett buff on a lot of your damage on Mavuika, and that tends to matter more than the Bennett buff on that cryo unit. That's part of why I like Diona in this slot a lot, because Diona doesn't do damage to begin with. Her biggest upside is the EM buff that she provides, and so she doesn't lose anything from not being able to snapshot Bennett. And then I guess probably the last setup I want to talk about is the Candace setup. This is a setup only for Candace C6. Obviously, non-C6 Candace doesn't have a way to apply off-field Hydro without you swapping, but C6 Candace does. However, unlike Singso and Yelan, it doesn't proc when you use a normal attack, it procs when you hit an enemy with a normal attack. What that means is that it doesn't work with Mavuika's charge attack. You have to actually do normal attacks. However, that doesn't mean there's no combos to make it work, because you don't need to proc it often. You only actually need to proc it twice. So, let me show you what the rotation is supposed to look like. And just like that, we end up getting 4 vapes on the charge attacks, 1 vape on a normal attack, a total of 8 charge attacks, and 2 normal attacks. All of that burst buffed. which is actually pretty good. In terms of just the damage from Mavuika without looking at external buffs, it's pretty similar to the other Vape setups, but obviously Candace herself doesn't really provide anything, because that normal attack buff is kind of whatever. But still, this is another team where you can use Candace as off-field hydro application. One thing I will say though is that doing normal attack into charge attack is harder than it sounds, because you have to start holding late enough that you won't skip the normal attack, but early enough that you won't accidentally do an N2. And when you're also concentrating on like not getting hit and stuff like that, it can be a bit of a pain. In any case, that is going to do it for the combo video. I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope the combos will help you improve your gameplay. I'm enjoying Mavuika a lot. All the combo stuff is really fun for me. So I hope you're enjoying it as well. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.